After going through this lesson, you shall be able to be first aware of factors considered by investors as they decide on investment location. Second, identify key issues in designing a framework to attract FDI by host countries. Third, describe incentives for promoting FDI. Fourth, assess the implications of incentives for FDI. Fifth, provide empirical evidence of competing scenarios for attracting FDI. And lastly, explain Make in India campaign and the effect on FDI. Introduction. Regarding FDI, the objective of policy should be to attract and provide favorable environment to investors so that they carry out their business operations profitably. In most host countries, attracting FDI, which is a major instrument for promoting economic development. Different countries use diverse terminologies interchangeably for FDI. They could call it promotions or incentives. Most often, developing countries offer MNCs incentives in the form of fiscal, financial, and regulatory. It is also important to keep in mind that a country's trade policy and FDI are interrelated and they intermingle with trade-related investment measures. Export orientation attracts FDI and FDI contributes to export competitiveness. In this lesson, an attempt is made to delineate a large number of factors and variables determining FDI inflows in host countries. The elasticity of factors and variables relating to FDI has an important implication for policy. There has been a remarkable change in global regulatory environment. To attract FDI, many host countries have resorted to liberalizing their trade and tariff policies, which led to easing of controls on FDI, acquisitions, deregulation of industries, privatization. In recent decades, all these factors have become catalysts for FDI's promotion and its expanded role. Factors considered by investors on investment location. Investment promotion activities are defined in terms of disseminating information about or attempt to create an image of the investment site, provide investment services for the prospective investors. Investors consider peace and security in host countries to be the necessary condition. But this factor is not a sufficient condition to attract foreign investment. There are many associated conditions that have to be put in place to exert a pull on FDI. The point to note is that the host country must ensure an attractive investment environment. According to OECD, the most effective steps by host country will be to meet investors' expectations to attract FDI inflows. These are expectations of MNCs, which are 1. Transparency in public sector activities. Secondly, impartial system of courts and law enforcement. Third, rules and their implementation rest on the principle of non-discrimination between foreign and domestic enterprise and are in accordance with international law. Fourth, providing the right of free transfers related to an investment and protecting against arbitrary expropriation. Fifth, putting in place adequate framework for a healthy, competitive environment in the domestic business sector. Sixth, removing obstacles to international trade. Seventh, ensuring that the public spending is adequate and relevant. Eighth, redress those aspects of the tax system that constitute a barrier to FDI. In addition to this, a World Bank report of the year 2010 has emphasized the significance of regulatory framework, which entails good regulations, well-organized procedures, and effective institutions for promoting FDI. This report highlighted the drawback of restrictive and outmoded laws and regulations which hinder FDI. Examples of such restrictive regulations are in the form of red tape, meager execution of laws. These all add to obstacles to allow FDI to enter into the country. it is important to remember the role of institutions and quality of governance, which have profound effect in the perception of MNCs for making investment in the host countries, because good governance is linked to higher economic growth. Presence of sound institutions diminish the possibility of corruption, which helps in reduced transaction cost of FDI, the enhancement of greater profit, and added merit of having sound institutions and governance weakens the perceptions of MNCs towards economic and political uncertainty. This factor of institutional setup and governance has been included in the Governance Effectiveness Index, also known as the Kaufman Index. This index has assigned weightage and included the quality of public and civil services, the degree of its independence from political pressures, the quality of policy formation and implementation, and the credibility of the government's commitment to such policy. Score is assigned on the scale of -2.5 to +2.5. Higher score means government procedures are more efficient. Common wisdom would suggest that higher FDI flows are a reflection of good practice in government policy and corporate governance. Macroeconomic sustainability in the form of lower inflation, steady exchange rate are also considered favorable to attract larger volume of FDI. This factor contributes to diminished uncertainty risk as it helps to moderate inflation and exchange rate volatility. In this context, macroeconomic sustainability highlights two variables, which are government finances and external sector of the host country. Fiscal sustainability connotes the ratio between gross fiscal deficit, also known as GFD, to gross domestic product, which is known as GDP, and external sector sustainability means net international investment position, also called IIP, to GDP ratio. These two variables are considered by MNCs while making decisions for investment because they feel confident of the protection of their investment. Existence of favorable situation in host country boosts a larger stock of FDI, and this is considered as a green signal of a benign business environment for MNCs. They feel attracted to make further investment. Additionally, by coming together with other firms, new investors inclined to take advantage of positive spillover effects from existing investors in the host countries. Scholars have characterized this in the terminology of agglomeration or clustering effect. All the above noted factors are in the nature of pull factors. However, besides these pull or demand side factors, some other factors also become relevant for MNCs. Such factors are commonly expressed in the terms of push factors, and they include prevailing global economic environment and policy posture of the developed countries. For instance, availability of higher global liquidity would lead to larger flow of investment to host countries as they search for higher returns. The important point is to ensure the factors which MNCs consider while making FDI in host countries. To recapitulate, once again, these factors are consistent macroeconomic policies, good governance, economic stability, guarantee of property rights, and rule of law and absence of corruptions. Above all, host countries should also maintain consistency and predictability in their economic policies and political stability. It has also been the experience of international agencies like Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, also known as OECD, that these factors are considered by investors as they decide on investment location. Domestic investment either substitutes for or complements FDI. MNC strategy of market seeking or resource seeking FDI account for the majority of FDI in host countries. With the arrival of new regulator in 1995 in the field of international trade, the World Trade Organization, known as WTO, has created a major challenge to policymakers. WTO is a rule-based organization, Member countries of WTO have to follow rules-based approach to policy matters. This has led to diminishing the barriers to global factor mobility. Not only this, an important implication of this rules-based approach is in the form of expansion of the range of FDI policy instruments, which are also known as PI, according to Frank L. Bartels and S.A. D. Krombrugge. Such PI's expansion includes all the factors and variables of FDI determinants and motivation. At the same time, this rules-based approach has resulted in diluting policy discretion and making viable PIs in a systematic manner based on rigorous analysis. An investor has to take a decision regarding all these aspects while investing. Framework to attract FDI by host countries. Many factors influence the FDI flows to developing countries, but one must first take into account the most obvious one, which is frequently ignored, namely the eagerness of the host country to permit it. In the past, many countries have positioned difficult restrictions on the scope for FDI, even when seeking to promote it. IFC has pointed that many restrictions were imposed on FDI inflows. Such restrictions take the form of limits on entry to certain sectors, complex approval mechanism, high taxes, complex incentive regimes, restrictions on share of foreign ownership, restriction on use of land, and expatriate labor. These restrictions have been imposed because of certain compulsions and concern about FDI influence on the national economy of the host country. Recipient host country worries relate due to undue foreign influence, damage to national wealth, need to promote indigenous entrepreneurship, jobs for workers, aspirations to acquire transfer of technology and management techniques. Predictably, all this has acted as a disincentive. However, for over 5 decades now, economic development has become synonymous with inviting FDI, and in recent times, a number of developing countries reduced their restriction. Host countries are competing with other such countries to receive more FDI by offering more attractive FDI environment and incentives. There has been a pronounced change in the perception of host countries, and this is reflected in their approach to trade liberalization, free trade agreements, delegation visiting to various foreign destinations to invite more investment, and so on. They also implement policy measures to attract FDI inflows. Furthermore, policymakers need to move beyond the idea of attracting FDI, because there has been an emergence of new operational patterns of FDI, which are characterized by international networked system of industrial sourcing, technology, production, marketing, and servicing, and place a serious challenge on policy making in the host countries. This has necessitated that host countries' economic and industrial policies have to be both appropriate and well sequenced if they want to succeed in capturing the kind of FDI that would boost their industrial development. Frank L. Bartels and S.A. D. Krombrugge have emphasized that MNCs not only consider home and host country characteristics when they decide to invest, but also third locations. There is empirical evidence that regions surrounded by large markets tend to attract more FDI, especially when their investment deal with vertical integration, as they will be motivated to take advantage of the comparative advantage of different locations. Since FDI decisions are multilateral, multivariate by nature, the interdependence between host destination is gaining magnitude in MNC's decision making, and hence should be increasingly factored into the crafting of developing countries, PIs as well as their implementation. In the case of service sector, WTO's General Agreement of Trade in Services, also known as GATS or GATS, places a different kind of policy framework to fulfill the rules relating to trade-related investment measures, or TRIM, S, also known as TRIMS. Similarly, WTO rules also impinge on FDI inflow issues in relation to the agreement on subsidies, countervailing measures, trade-related intellectual property right, which is TRIPS. These provisions are considered internationally as hard law, particularly for host countries, as they are required to design the FDI regime which is in consonance with policy instrument PIs. Host countries need to bear in mind not only the changing strategies and decision-making process of MNCs, as well as the international rules of WTO that are reducing the scope for policy schemes, but also the competing policy and strategies of other FDI host locations. Facilitating this discussion, Lowendahl has suggested a framework for making suitable policy instruments for attracting FDI. UNIDO, in its report of 2003, has emphasized that a high level of policy coherence is very important, as it will enhance the probability that the national development priorities will be accomplished. This coherence should appear in the government policies and also materialize when these policies are translated into law. Getting policies right may not be enough. Active investment promotion may be required as well. The rapid increase in FDI volumes in recent years has shown that this is not a zero-sum game. As more and more countries open up to FDI, global integration will increase, leading to an increase overall FDI flows. The challenge for the future is to open more sectors to FDI, thereby bringing opportunities for economic development to a larger part of the economy. However, as noted by the United Nations report of 2003, attracting foreign investment is not enough. The national policies that will make the investment beneficial to the economy are crucial. For various reasons, it is also important to avoid FDI in some specific and sensitive sectors of the economy. While trying to understand FDI dynamics from the viewpoint of foreign investors, host countries should not do the following. 1. Change the rules after the MNCs have already invested. Second, make an effort to have a vertically integrated industry from the raw materials to the final assembly. Third, attempt to use domestically available natural resource unless they are of highest quality and at a lower cost. Fourth, building supporting industries, because technical transfer will take time. This must be done in proper speed and sequence. Fifth, accumulate assembly type FDI first without selectivity. Technology transfer will come after this, not before. Work cooperatively with foreign investors. Create superior locational advantage. Lower the cost of doing business. Export-oriented FDI should be welcomed most, while domestically oriented FDI is a different story and must be treated differently. The important point is that aspiring host countries have to create a very positive perception to prospective investors to attract FDI inflows. Incentives for promoting FDI. Having discussed policy framework for the promotion of FDI, we now proceed to analyze incentives given to FDI inflows. Here the point to note is that policy framework and incentives overlap as they are interrelated. Remember, incentives are provided under a given policy framework. UNCTAD or UNCTAD has defined FDI incentive in terms of any measurable advantages accorded to specific enterprises or categories of enterprises by or at the direction of a government in order to encourage them to behave in a certain manner. They include measures specifically designed either to increase the rate of return of a particular FDI undertaking or to reduce or redistribute its cost or risk. They do not include broader non-discriminatory policies such as infrastructure, the general legal regime for FDI, the general regulatory and fiscal regime for business operations, free repatriation of profits or national treatment. While these policies certainly bear on the locational decision of transnational corporations, they are not FDI incentives per se. OECD study has divided FDI incentives into 3 categories, namely fiscal, financial and regulatory incentives. Thus, incentives can be fiscal or non-fiscal. Fiscal or tax incentives have been defined as any incentive that reduces the tax burden of enterprises in order to induce them to invest in a particular project or sectors. There are exceptions to the general tax regime. Tax incentives would include, for example, reduced tax rates on profit, tax holidays, accounting rules that allow accelerated depreciation and loss carry forwards for tax purposes, and reduced tariffs on imported equipment, components and raw materials, or increased tariffs to protect the domestic market for import substituting investment projects. Financial incentives are defined as direct contributions to the firm from the government, including direct capital subsidies, subsidized loans or dedicated infrastructure. Policies of offering financial FDI incentives are often formally take the shape of infrastructure subsidies, job training subsidies, relocation, expatriation support, administrative assistance. The regulatory FDI incentives are policies of attracting MNCs by offering them an exemption form or relaxation of national or subnational rules and regulation. In actual practice, such regulatory incentives relate to easing of environmental, social and labor market related requirements. Various studies have concluded that the most commonly used inducement are the fiscal FDI incentive. Some of the fiscal and non-fiscal incentives are illustrated in the table. The source of what we are going to tell you now is the UNCTAD 1996 World Investment Report, Investment, Trade and International Policy Arrangement. The policy dimension for incentives may be of 2 types, one general, one specific. General incentives are applied for overall economic development goals. So, we have fiscal and non-fiscal. Let's look at the fiscal first. Amongst the fiscal, tax holidays, tax-free imports, tax exemptions, low corporate taxes, losses against future profits, accelerated capital depreciation, investment or reinvestment permits, lower social security payments. Now, if we move on to the non-fiscal, they are depreciation methods, development banks loan policies, R&D or research and development support, environmental standard support, labor training support, government subsidies, regulatory exemption, financial incentives which could be of the form of direct subsidies, subsidized loan, loan guarantees and public venture capital availabilities. Also guaranteed export credits and government insurance at low rate, and the other incentives could be subsidized dedicated infrastructure, services, government contracts. On the other hand, some of the fiscal incentives could be of the form of tax reduction based on staff and marketing expenses, MVA based incentives, local content based tax reduction, import based incentives, duty exemption tax credit, export based incentive, duty exemptions, preferential tax on export incomes, tax reduction on foreign exchange, tax reduction on export performance. Specific incentives have discretionary perspective. The other aspect of dimension is the durability of incentive. Durability depends on the host country priorities. As per such priority, incentives could be either permanent or temporary. But pragmatically speaking, duration of incentives will be determined by the kind of development the country desires. And this may necessitate a change in the duration of incentives. So, incentives are in the nature of windows of opportunity, which may open or close. The temporal or spatial incentives relate to geographic area and work either at a local, national or regional level. As such, incentive is an instrument which can be used to promote specific regions of a country or the whole economy or certain sectors or subsectors by attracting FDI inflows. All this depends on the specific needs of the country. A word of caution for incentives is that there is no substitute for pursuing the appropriate general policy measures. There should be an attractive, enabling environment for investment. Along with this, some effects beyond jurisdictions are to be taken into account. According to OECD study, many countries offer FDI incentives would prefer not to do so and actually are concerned about the cost. But most countries have the realization that they would be unable to attract certain FDI inflows if they did not offer an incentive package broadly as generous as the ones available elsewhere. Michael R. Sinskota has pointed out that incentive policies may succeed in luring new industries to a location, in creating new jobs, but they may also have several drawbacks. For example, when countries compete for foreign investment, several of them may offer more or less the same investment package. The slight advantage that the incentive of one country may have over another's package generally makes little difference in the investment site selected. Moreover, investment policies aimed at attracting foreign direct investment may occasionally place established domestic firms at a disadvantage if they do not receive any support. So, it is also important to note that incentives are hardly ever a first best option. Assessing the implications of incentives for FDI. Given the context, MNCs have to recognize the need to give due weightage to the interests of adhering to host countries' specific laws, regulation, and administrative practices in the field of FDI inflows. They should make their endeavor as transparent as possible for avoiding adverse comments from the recipient countries. OECD is of the view that it is inappropriate for the host countries to encourage investment by lowering health, safety, or environmental standards or relaxing core labor standards. The organization has proposed a checklist to assess the cost and benefit of using incentives to attract FDI, to provide operational criteria for avoiding wasteful effects, and to warn against the pitfalls and risk of excessive reliance on incentive-based strategies. A large body of evidence shows that investors are principally motivated by the quality of host countries' enabling environment. Hence, policies to enhance macroeconomic stability, transparency, other elements of good governance, openness to trade, infrastructure, and the levels of know-how in the domestic economy are all more potent tools for attracting investment. FDI incentives, many cases at most, be the tip that balances in favor of some of the challenges and risks facing authorities involved in development and implementing strategies for offering FDI incentives. However, designing a policy framework along with efficient incentive measures is a complex exercise. Further, the objective of host countries making efforts for larger volume of FDI inflows is not incommensurate with transfer of profits by MNCs to their home countries. Magnus Blomstrom and Ari Coco have argued that good governance, making incentives available on equal terms to all investors, foreign and domestic, and incentive packages should be a part of the country's overall economic development and should focus on those activities that generate the durable potential for spillovers, including linkage between foreign and local firms, education and training, and R&D. In his study, Ramkishan S. Rajan has also highlighted that any FDI promotion strategy should be built upon the following pillars. First, image building activities, promoting the country, its regions, its states as favorable location for investment. Such activities include focused advertising, public relation events, generation of favorable news stories by cultivating journalists, information provision, one-stop shop service aimed at expediting approval process and various assistance in obtaining sites, utility, etc. Second, investment generating activities through direct targeting of firms by promotion of specific sectors and industries, and personal selling and establishing direct contacts with prospective investors. Activities include identification of potential sectors and investors, direct mailing, telephone campaign, investor forums, seminars, individual presentations to target investors. Third, policy advocacy consists of the activities via which the agency supports initiatives to improve the investment climate and identifies the views of the private sector on that matter. Activities include survey of the private sector, participation in task force, policy, legal proposals, lobbying, and fourth, raising the realization ratio. That is the percentage of FDI approvals translated into actual flows. It is also suggested that one-stop investment promotion agency could facilitate FDI by lowering administrative delays and associated cost overruns. On this point, Sanjaya Lal has correctly emphasized that unless the agencies have the authority needed to negotiate the regulatory system and unless the rules themselves are simplified, this may not help. On the contrary, there is a very real risk that a one-stop shop becomes one more stop. The desire to attract FDI inflows often leads countries to engage in a global competition. Countries are increasingly competing with each other to attract FDI by offering a number of incentives and other concessionary measures. It is important to keep in mind that the incentive package should be studied carefully for not making undeserved favors to foreign investors because of the fact that these incentive packages not always are dominant for investment decision. Incentives play a limited role in investment decisions if compared with other factors, which are political and economic stability. These should be very important when an investment decision is made. The very nature of the subject, with its heavily political overtone, permits few settled conclusions. Policymakers have always to bear in mind that attracting FDI does not constitute an end in itself, but a means to boost economic development. Competing scenario for attracting FDI. In today's competitive and ever-changing business environment, no business organization is certain about tomorrow. That forces them to look for newer destination, newer market to capture. On the one hand, there have been debates about the awareness and understanding of MNCs to make overseas investment, and on the other hand, various strategies followed by host countries in order to attract FDI. No development without foreign investment is also a central argument for European Commission to press developing countries to negotiate regional free trade agreements as large regional markets are more attractive to FDI, and to include liberalization and deregulation of FDI in their policy strategy. This was the case in the Economic Partnership Agreement (EPA) signed in 2008 by the European Union and the Caribbean states. While the large multinational corporations of West are getting advantage of market expansion from FDI, the host countries are also utilizing it as a major mechanism and a source for accelerating their domestic economic growth. There is little doubt on the fact that while a large company from the US or Europe consider going into diversified operation across the globe, the first thing that came into their mind is the size of the market. It is always essential for attracting the foreign investors, as it is the prime consideration prior to investing their money into foreign countries. When we just talk about the size of the market, the name of two countries immediately come into our mind. These are India and China. Walmart has made a lot of FDI in China, while Hyundai has done the same in India. There has been competition for FDI among countries at different stages of development by increasing the supply of public inputs in the economy, in addition to or instead of offering subsidies or tax relief to foreign investors. Competing countries may offer substitute or tax relief to foreign investors and or may commit to increasing their spending on public inputs contingent on the foreign investor's decision. While incentives are beneficial only for the foreign companies, additional public inputs increase the output of domestic companies as well. So if governments of competing in countries are not allowed to discriminate between domestic and foreign firms. There may be situations in which a less developed economy attracts the FDI depending upon low labor cost differential and on the responsiveness of foreign and domestic companies to changes in the supply of public inputs. A less developed country has better chances of obtaining the FDI if the investment project is more labor intensive. It can win the investment even in the case where its gains from FDI are smaller than in a highly developed country. If tax discrimination between domestic and foreign firms is permitted, the more developed country will always attract the foreign investment. On the other hand, if discrimination is not possible, the optimal supply of public inputs from host countries' perspective is always higher with FDI. This justifies and indeed necessitates the inclusion of public inputs as location determinant. Public policy matters for the location decision of investors. Along with globalization, many developing and emerging economies, for attracting more and more FDI, have raised policymakers' concern about intensifying global competition among governments, which may have undesirable effect. In this context, the main concern relates to global bidding wars to attract FDI, which may result in uncontrolled upward spiral in costly investment incentives that weaken public finance, introduce market distortions in the allocation of real investment, and or that such wars are putting excessive downward pressure on global standards of protection of the environment or workers' rights. There might be positive effects of attracting FDI in the form of inducing governments to strengthen their economy, fundamentals to enhance the supply of modern infrastructure, appropriately trained workers, achieving greater macroeconomic and political stability by improving long-term economic growth prospects. The actual degree of global competition to attract FDI is not known. However, there is considerable evidence that such competition is widespread. The related OECD study has come to the following conclusion. One, as barriers to international investment have fallen over the last 2 decades, the significance of competition for FDI has increased. Second, incentive-based competition for FDI is a global phenomenon. Governments at all levels, national and subnational, in both OECD and non-OECD countries engage in it worldwide. Third, incentive-based competition can be intense, but the evidence suggests that competition tends to be quite intense only in particular industries. For example, automobiles, or for particular investment projects, especially large ones, and in some industries is intense only during particular period. Most incentive-based competition is effectively inter-regional, since much of the real investment for which national and subnational governments compete is investment that the investor intends in principle to locate to a particular region. For major new investment projects, normally a 2-stage or a multi-stage process in which investors first draw up a short list of acceptable sites on the basis of economic and political fundamentals of alternative sites, largely irrespective of the availability of fiscal and financial incentives from potential host government. And only later do investors consider and often seek out investment incentives, sometimes playing one government off another at this stage of their location decision. And seventh, incentives and other discretionary government policies to attract FDI can thus be decisive in investors' location decision, despite the much greater overall importance that investors attach to fundamentals. The global supply of FDI has risen significantly. Governments have intensified competition with one another to attract their share of that growth. Several factors have stimulated the growth of FDI, including liberalization and market deregulation, globalization of corporate activity, and competition. The distortionary effects of incentives can be significant. They tend to render the broader policy making process more vulnerable to rent-seeking behavior, perhaps including corruption, which can be very costly. undiscerning use of investment incentives, and other discretionary policies by governments to attract FDI can have a negative effect on FDI inflows, in part because the incentive programs and policies tend to be seen by investors as unsustainable. Many of the governments that are most successful in attracting FDI are also among those that best meet the requirement for good governance by making them likely to be seen as sustainable. Competition for FDI among subnational governments has been activated by a broader process of reform of policy making, which includes regulatory reform, privatization, and liberalization of trade and investment policies. Investors often choose sites where the host government strategy to attract investors is a part of a broader process of mobilization around a project of social and political reform in which the government redefines its role, turning away from rigid structures and exclusive relationships with vested interest groups in favor of greater transparency, democracy, and market competition. This process both enhances and is reinforced by growing exposure of local and foreign firms in the domestic market to international competition. Policy makers must remain vigilant to ensure that competition to attract FDI does not lower labor and environmental standard, but works, if anything, in the opposite direction. Governments and societies would benefit in this regard from enhanced international policy coordination on environmental standards and also on core labor standards. For developing and emerging economies, it is important to stress the value of moving away from discretionary incentive towards greater reliance on rule-based means of attracting FDI. Strong rules-based approach, which should include a strong and independent judiciary system, can also provide the policy transparency necessary to limit the rent-seeking behavior that can be damaging to development. Make in India campaign and effect on FDI. The Indian manufacturing sector has a great potential. There is a long journey ahead that starts with reviving the industry and achieving global competitiveness, followed by claiming global leadership. Key thrust of the program would be on cutting down in delays in manufacturing projects, develop adequate infrastructure, and make it easier for companies to do business in India. The 25 key sectors identified under the program include automobiles, auto components, biotechnology, chemicals, defense manufacturing, electronic systems, food processing, leather, mining, oil and gas, ports, railways, and textiles. The growth in FDI has been significant after the launch of Make in India initiatives. Government amended the FDI policy to further enable a positive investment climate. India's stand on FDI policy regime is investor friendly and also promotes investment, leading to increased manufacturing, job creation, and overall economic growth of the country. The emphasis of foreign investment policy on efficient and competitive domestic manufacturing will serve multiple objectives. It is of paramount importance that the foreign investment, foreign trade, and intellectual property rights policies are viewed in a holistic manner to ensure that they mutually reinforce each other in achieving the policy objectives of world-class domestic manufacturing. It needs to be remembered that investment opportunities as reflected by a large domestic market, low-cost skilled and unskilled man may be a necessary but not a sufficient condition to induce foreign investors to come to India with their capital and technology. The focus of foreign investment policy should be on the positive aspect of what is produced in India and what kind of technology and skills and how efficient and competitively it is produced and whether it is of world-class standards and not on negative aspects such as ownership, control, enterprise-specific performance requirements or other conditions that interfere with internal commercial decisions of the enterprise. The best way to ensure that foreign investment is of high quality and yields value to the country is to have a policy framework that requires it to operate in an unprotected, open and competitive environment not behind high tariff walls or import restrictions, nor with the aid of subsidies or other giveaways. With respect to the contours of the foreign trade policy, it is by and large confined now to dealing with exports and imports compartmentally, encouragement of exports with various kinds of subsidies and prop-ups, curtailment of imports by high tariff and other so-called trade remedy measures like anti-dumping or countervailing duties or other import restrictions. Encouragement of domestic manufacturing or world-class standards, either by domestic or foreign investors or both, has not been a major objective of our foreign trade policy so far. Foreign trade policy must recognize that encouragement of domestic manufacturing of world-class standards catering solely even to our own market is a preferable alternative to protection and subsidization through high tariffs, trade remedy measures and financial giveaways. Rather, the policy must encourage freer imports of capital goods, industrial raw materials, components, tools and devices, as well as technology-laden imports with a view to upgrading the quality and competitiveness of our domestic manufacturing. The importance of the protection of IPRs in the scheme of attracting foreign investment and establishing high quality domestic manufacturing must not be overlooked. IPRs do not consist only of pharmaceutical patents, they include as well copyright, which is computer software in our country is protected by copyright, trademarks, trade secrets, geographical indications, design, business confidential information and data. Even if IPR policies do not have domestic manufacturing as a central objective, they need to be implemented in such a way that they do not impede or deter technology-oriented domestic investment from foreign investors. The protection of patents, trademark, trade secrets, layout designs and the like is crucial to these and other sectors where India desires foreign investment of high quality with modern technology. India's intellectual property laws are largely in conformity with international standards as reflected in the TRIPS agreement of the WTO and other international conventions to which India has subscribed. While FDI inflows into Make in India industries have increased, the export focus of the campaign seems to have been diluted in favor of the digital India sectors. In addition, although FDI inflows into the automobile sector, a pillar of the Make in India mission, have been growing, the trend suggests that they have been focusing more on domestic demand rather than on export growth. The profile of recent FDI flows is indicative of investments done to tap the domestic household consumption rather than catalyze exports. For Make in India program, it is not enough to assume that merely opening up the domestic economy will attract FDI. The benefits from it could be harnessed on the base of policy pragmatism, prevalence of productive firms, effective forward and backward linkages, fair competition and tax laws, investor protection, and an infrastructure and legal framework that will work at the required speed. India needs to keep these factors into account while making policies. The congeniality of the investment environment depends more on the policies and the rules as well as the conditions attached to the approval of the investments to assure foreign investors of fair and non-discriminatory treatment. India has enough architecture in the form of well-developed democratic system, a wide range of policy-making institutions, robust regulatory authorities, extensive financial markets, risk-assuming and risk-transfer instruments, and enterprising people. That makes it much easier to stir and stimulate growth with sound policy interventions to boost the plan of Make in India a success. The Indian manufacturing sector provides an opportunity to international investors to collaborate with existing business, as most of the business have plans to expand through various options. The foreign investors have ample opportunity to come and make in India. The firms located in various states are willing to expand their operation, diversify their business, look forward to collaborations which can be reaped in by the international community. However, there are few problems which are faced by the firm which need to be addressed. With various initiatives being implemented by the government to facilitate the ease of doing business, the manufacturing sector is expected to pick up pace and will provide immense opportunities to domestic and international investors to come and make in India in the coming times. The aim of policies for attracting FDI must necessarily be to provide investors with an environment in which they can conduct their business profitably and without incurring unnecessary risk. The objective of policy of FDI incentives is to strike a balance between MNC and host countries' long-term benefits. In doing so, they must ensure that the benefits exceed the cost and that the cost of achieving given goals are kept to their lowest feasible level. It is in host countries where the benefits and costs of FDI are often more visible. Factors behind FDI decisions are ownership policies, tax subsidy measures, policy concerning convertibility of foreign exchange and remittance of earnings, price control measures, performance requirement, sector-specific limitation, incentives and miscellaneous entry, and procedural rules that are assumed to impose a considerable cost on a potential FDI. All these constitute business environment of the host country. Incentive influence both domestic and foreign investment and are important for any development strategy as they complement each other. Incentives used by policy makers to facilitate FDI are of three types: fiscal, financial, and non-financial. Fiscal incentives are specific tax measures designed to attract the foreign investor. Financial incentives offer special funding for the investor by providing, for example, land or building, loans and loan guarantee. Non-financial incentives can consist of guaranteed government purchases, special protection from competition through tariffs, import quotas, local content requirements, and investment in infrastructure facilities. All of these incentives by themselves are unlikely to spur an investment decision if the proper market conditions do not exist. The economic benefits of attracting FDI are generally associated with positive externalities called spillovers towards the host economy. The presence and magnitude of such spillovers is of crucial importance if FDI incentives are to be economically justified. The relative advantage and disadvantage of policy instruments are viewed through the lens of policy coherence and fit in spatial sequencing and switching terms with the country's evolving economic and temporary circumstances and conditions. Trade policy is one of the main determinants of MNCs in their investment decisions. Generally, liberalizing trade policies will encourage FDIs and will also encourage domestic investment. Liberalizing trade policies can be both an incentive for investment and a catalyst for its positive effects on growth, and this is true from the perspective of both the host and the home countries. One of the best tools that a country can use to encourage more foreign direct investment is free trade agreements. FDI policy framework should be predictable and non-discriminatory, regulatory environment, and absence of undue administrative impediments to business. Globalization and its pace continue to drive FDI flows wherever the economic environment is open to it. To create an enabling environment for FDI, host countries must have a very feasible agenda of policy reform. Trends in FDI have reflected changes in policy stance by developing countries. FDI in developing countries has flowed mainly into the manufacturing, processing, and services sector. When assessing the effect and appropriateness of FDI incentives, the position of investors and policy makers need to be taken into account. Once policy makers have agreed on their preferred strategy for FDI attraction, the design of appropriate policies presents them with a further array of complex choices.